The child brings home the test, 92%. Her mother looks at the paper. No smile, just a question. What happened to the other 8? The child's face changes. Something inside her registers this as information. Not just about the test, about how love works. She tries again the following week. 96%. This time a smile. Warmth. Approval flowing where moments before there had been only assessment. And again, something inside her takes note. The equation forms without words. Performance equals affection. Achievement equals worth. Do well, receive warmth. Fall short, watch it retract. This is not teaching, this is training. And the currency being established is not grades. It is something far more fundamental. The child is learning that love is not a constant. It is a variable. Something earned through meeting standards. Something withdrawn when those standards slip. And years later, when she cannot understand why she feels hollow after every success, why approval from others never quite fills the space inside her, why she is exhausted from a performance that never ends, the equation is still running, still calculating, still trying to earn what should never have required earning in the first place. And the most disturbing part is this: the system works. It works so well that most people never realize they are inside it. What if the most powerful control mechanism in human relationship is not violence or manipulation, but something quieter, something that looks like love but functions like payment, something that feels like connection but operates like transaction? What if the people you are closest to have been training you all along? Today we examine what happens when emotional responses become currency, when approval, affection, and validation are dispensed not as expressions of connection but as reinforcement for desired behavior. We explore how this transforms relationships into hidden economies, why the most invisible forms of control feel like intimacy, and what happens to the self when it learns that love must be earned. This investigation draws on research into conditional regard, operant conditioning in relationships, and the psychology of transactional intimacy. What we will find is not comfortable, because if you recognize yourself in this examination, it means the people who shaped you were not giving freely. They were trading, and you have been performing ever since. As you read this, notice something. When you think about disappointing someone close to you, failing to meet an expectation, saying no, withdrawing your attention, what do you feel? Not what you think, but what you feel. Is there fear beneath the guilt? Is there a calculation happening before you even register it consciously? An assessment of what your defiance will cost you in warmth, in acceptance, in the emotional resources you rely on? That calculation is the currency system at work, and most people never realize they are operating inside one until it is too late to remember what connection felt like before it became commerce. Not because they are unaware, but because the system feels normal. Normal is the most effective disguise control has. Operant conditioning is not abstract theory. It is the mechanism through which all behavior is shaped. An action occurs, a consequence follows. If the consequence is rewarding, the action becomes more likely. If the consequence is punishing, the action becomes less likely. This is how animals learn. This is how humans learn. And this is how relationships, whether the participants realize it or not, function as behavior modification systems. The research is unambiguous. When affection is given contingently, when warmth increases in response to desired behavior and decreases in response to undesired behavior, the recipient learns to perform, not consciously, not with awareness of the transaction, but at the level of nervous system patterning. The lesson embeds itself. Psychologists call this conditional positive regard when affection is increased to reward compliance. They call it conditional negative reward when affection is withdrawn to punish defiance. Both are forms of control. Both reshape the recipient's behavior, and both feel to the person experiencing them like love, because they are packaged as love. The parent who lights up when the child achieves and goes cold when the child fails. The partner who is warm and attentive after you accommodate their needs, and distant and irritable when you assert your own. The friend who is available and supportive when you are useful and unavailable when you need something in return. These are not aberrations. This is how most relationships operate. And the invisibility of the mechanism is precisely what makes it so effective. Research into parental conditional regard reveals the long-term psychological cost. Children raised with conditional affection develop what is called contingent self-esteem. Their sense of worth is not stable. It fluctuates based on performance. They feel valuable when they meet expectations. They feel worthless when they do not. This is not a cognitive decision. This is learned reality. The child's nervous system has been trained to associate approval with worthiness and disapproval with unworthiness. The mechanism is identical to how a laboratory animal learns to press a lever for food. The difference is that the food in this case is emotional nourishment, and when that nourishment becomes conditional, the organism learns to work for it, and the body believes that. If your body feels tighter as you hear this, that's no coincidence. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The training does not feel like training. It feels like relationship. The child does not think my parent is using intermittent reinforcement to shape my behavior. The child thinks, when I do well, my parent loves me. When I fail, I am not enough. This is the kind of learning that happens before language, before choice, and once this pattern is learned, it does not stay in childhood. The same applies in adult relationships. The partner being conditioned does not recognize the operant system. They experience the emotional consequence, warmth or coldness, presence or withdrawal, and adjust their behavior accordingly. They do not see the ledger, they only feel the result. And the result is a self that exists in a constant state of performance anxiety, always calculating, always monitoring, always trying to earn the affection that should, in any healthy system, be unconditional. Studies using eye-tracking technology found that people in relationships characterized by high conditional regard exhibit avoidance behaviors when confronted with their own perceived inadequacies. Their gaze literally moves away from information that suggests they have fallen short, not because they are irresponsible, because the information triggers the threat of affection withdrawal, which means the problem is not the person's inability to face reality. The problem is that reality has become dangerous, because reality includes the possibility of not meeting standards, and not meeting standards means losing emotional supply. This pattern is common. That doesn't make it harmless, just widespread. This is exchange masquerading as intimacy, and the person trapped inside it is not a partner. They are a participant in an exchange system where their worth is perpetually up for negotiation. This is the foundation. Every pattern that follows is just this conditioning wearing a different mask. This chapter is not about affection being given. It is about affection being taken. Withholding is one of the most effective forms of punishment available in human relationships. It requires no physical force. It involves no overt threat. It is simply the removal of something the recipient has come to depend on: warmth, attention, affection, connection. And because the removal is enacted through silence, through coldness, through the absence of response, the recipient cannot fight it. They can only feel it, and what they feel is isolation, abandonment, the existential terror of being cut off from the emotional resources they need to survive psychologically. What makes this different from overt manipulation is that it doesn't look like control while it's happening. It looks like distance, like mood, like someone needing space. Research into emotional withholding identifies it as a form of avoidant abuse. Unlike overt aggression, which is visible and can be named, withholding operates through absence. The abuser does not attack, they simply disappear emotionally. And this disappearance communicates a message far more devastating than any words could convey. The message is, you do not deserve my presence. You do not deserve my warmth. You are being punished for your defiance, and the punishment is exile. And because humans are wired for connection, because isolation is perceived by the nervous system as a survival threat, the person experiencing withholding will do almost anything to restore the connection. They apologize, they comply, they abandon themselves, not because they are weak, but because the nervous system is trying to survive exile. This is not weakness, this is survival. And once the cold ends, and once the withholder deems the lesson learned and affection returns, the recipient does not think, I was just manipulated. They think, I fixed it. I earned my way back. The cycle is complete, the conditioning has worked, and the recipient has internalized the logic of the emotional economy. Affection is not given, it is earned, and it can be taken away. Withholding functions as negative punishment in operant conditioning terms. Something desirable is removed to decrease an unwanted behavior. And it works, because the pain of emotional absence is intolerable for most people. They will modify their behavior to avoid it. They will stop asserting themselves, stop disagreeing, stop existing as autonomous beings with needs that might conflict with the withholder's preferences. They will become compliant, accommodating, small, and the withholder, consciously or unconsciously, has achieved exactly what they wanted: control, maintained not through force but through the strategic deployment of emotional presence and absence. Nothing here requires bad intent for harm to occur. If this feels heavy, notice that. Not because it's overwhelming, but because it's accurate. If you felt confused rather than angry, that confusion makes sense. The system was designed to be invisible. Psychologists note that withholding is often a learned behavior. It is modeled in families where emotional expression was discouraged or punished, where vulnerability was met with rejection, where connection was conditional on performance and silence was weaponized to enforce conformity. Most people never name this, they just adapt to it. The person who withholds may not see themselves as abusive. They may see themselves as protecting their own boundaries, as asserting their needs, as refusing to engage with conflict. Often, they are repeating the only relational language they were ever taught, but the impact remains the same. The recipient experiences exile, and exile in the context of attachment is catastrophic. Because the person being withheld from cannot leave the relationship without abandoning their source of emotional nourishment, and they cannot stay without subjecting themselves to the cycle of conditional affection. They are trapped, and the trap is invisible, because it is constructed not from bars, but from the absence of warmth. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just a room that feels colder. What makes this particularly painful is that withholding is often justified. The withholder frames their silence as a response to the recipient's wrongdoing. You hurt me, so I am protecting myself. But protection and punishment are not the same thing. Protection involves setting a boundary. Punishment involves making the other person suffer for crossing one. And when suffering is inflicted through the removal of affection, the recipient learns that love is not safe. It is leverage, and they are not a person, they are a variable in someone else's emotional regulation strategy. Where does your mind go when someone you need stops responding? So far, we have looked at punishment, but control does not rely on pain alone. It also relies on reward. This chapter is not about coldness, it is about warmth used as leverage. Because warmth feels safer than punishment, but it can shape behavior just as effectively. This is not an argument against appreciation. It is an argument against appreciation with conditions attached. Punishment teaches you what not to do. Praise teaches you who you are allowed to be. Not all control looks like coldness. Some of it looks like warmth, excessive warmth, strategic warmth, warmth that appears when you do what is wanted and disappears when you do not. This is praise used not as an expression but as a tool, not recognition of who you are but evaluation of what you do. Recognition acknowledges your being. Praise, when conditional, judges your performance. And it works because humans crave approval. Praise works because it feels like oxygen to a nervous system trained to expect scarcity, especially from people they are attached to, especially when that approval has been inconsistent enough to make them uncertain of their standing. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They do not need to study behavioral psychology to know that intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest behavioral patterns. They simply observe what works, and what works is given affection unpredictably, sometimes rewarding the behavior, sometimes withholding the reward, keeping the recipient in a state of uncertainty, always performing, always hoping that this time the approval will come. Research into manipulation tactics identifies praise as a primary tool of psychological control. Not genuine praise, strategic praise, praise that serves the praiser's agenda, praise that inflates the recipient's sense of importance when they comply and deflates it when they resist. This is called positive reinforcement in operant conditioning. A reward is given to increase a desired behavior. The reward in this case is approval, validation, the sense of being valued. And because these are deeply craved by most people, because the need of recognition is fundamental, the reinforcement is powerful. But here is the problem. When praise is conditional, when it is dispensed strategically rather than authentically, it trains the recipient to perform, not to be, to perform, to monitor themselves constantly for compliance with the other person's expectations, to suppress parts of themselves that might not be rewarded, to curate their presentation to maximize approval. This is leverage, not connection. And if this feels familiar, it doesn't mean you were weak. It means you were human. Most of us learned this pattern long before we knew there was another option. And the person being praised is not being seen. They are being shaped. Love bombing is an extreme version of this dynamic. The manipulator overwhelms the target with affection, attention, and validation. Not because they feel it, because it works. It creates attachment rapidly. It makes the target dependent on the emotional high that the manipulator provides. And once dependency is established, the manipulator can withdraw at will. The target will do anything to restore the supply. This is not love, but addiction. The manipulator has become the drug. The target has become the addict, chasing the high, tolerating the withdrawal, convinced that better performance will restore the supply. But the supply never returns consistently, because consistency would eliminate the control. The target would know where they stood. They would feel secure, and security does not create desperation. Only intermittent reinforcement does that. Studies of manipulation in interpersonal relationships consistently find that praise, when used strategically, creates dependency, lowers self-esteem, and increases compliance. The recipient begins to doubt their own judgment. They defer to the manipulator's assessment of their worth. They become externally regulated. Their sense of self becomes contingent on the manipulator's approval. And this is precisely the point. The manipulator does not want an equal. They want someone who will accommodate, who will prioritize the manipulator's needs, who will not resist or challenge or assert independence. And praise, delivered intermittently and withdrawn strategically, creates exactly that dynamic. The recipient is left performing, endlessly performing, hoping that the next achievement, the next accommodation, the next suppression of self will finally earn them the stable affection they crave. But it never does, because stable affection was never on offer. Only the promise of it was, and promises in emotional economies are leverage. When love is conditional, the self fractures. It splits into two versions: the version that is presented and the version that is hidden. If this feels personal, that's not pathology, that's recognition. The presented self is the one that earns approval. It performs, it accommodates, it suppresses needs, preferences, boundaries, anything that might threaten the flow of affection. This is the self that is rewarded. This is the self that gets loved. The hidden self is everything else, the parts that are inconvenient, the needs that conflict with the other person's preferences, the anger that is not allowed, the disappointment that cannot be expressed, the exhaustion from endless performance. This hidden self does not disappear. It accumulates in the body, in the nervous system, in the constant low-level anxiety that something is wrong but cannot be named. Research into contingent self-worth reveals that people who were raised with conditional regard develop fragile identities. Their self-esteem fluctuates widely based on external feedback. They feel good about themselves when they achieve, they feel worthless when they fail, and because achievement is never guaranteed, they live in a state of chronic instability. They cannot rest, because resting means not performing, and not performing means risking the loss of affection. So they work, they achieve, they accommodate, they suppress, and they wonder why success never feels like enough. Why approval never quite feels the emptiness inside. The answer is that no amount of conditional affection can substitute for unconditional acceptance. The nervous system knows the difference. It knows when love is given freely and when it is given transactionally. And transactional love, no matter how abundant, always feels precarious, because it is. Studies of children raised with parental conditional regard show they develop introjected regulation. They internalize the conditions. They begin to police themselves. They no longer need the parent to withdraw affection. They withdraw it from themselves when they fall short. They become both the punisher and the punished, the supervisor and the supervised, the judge and the judged. This is the ultimate success of conditioning. The external system becomes internal. The child grows into an adult who no longer needs others to enforce the performance standards. They enforce them on themselves. And they experience the failure to meet those standards not as external disappointment, but as self-hatred. This is what conditional love does. It teaches people to hate themselves for being human, for having needs, for falling short, for not being perfect. None of this is a personal failure. It is a predictable outcome of a system that required you to trade yourself to survive. Let that land. And that self-hatred masquerades as motivation, as discipline, as high standards. But it is not. It is internalized punishment, the consequence of a childhood or relationship where love was something earned rather than something given. When affection becomes conditional, intimacy becomes impossible, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the safety to be seen in failure, in need, in imperfection. But when failure means losing love, vulnerability becomes existentially dangerous. So the person shaped by conditional regard learns to hide, not just from others, from themselves. They cannot afford to see their own inadequacy, because seeing it means confronting the possibility that they are unlovable, that the affection they receive is not real, that they are performing in an economy that will never pay them what they are owed. And some part of them know this. Some part of all of us who learn this way knows that the love we are working for is not love at all, it is approval, and approval is not the same as acceptance. Approval is conditional on continued performance. Acceptance is recognition of inherent worth. And when you have only ever known the former, the latter feels impossible to believe in. What would you lose if you stopped performing? If arguments in your life feel like audits, you already know this system. Seeing the ledger is already an act of disobedience. Some relationships operate like ledgers. Every act of care is recorded, every favor is tallied, every emotional investment is tracked, and when the balance tips, resentment follows. You know this pattern when you see it. The partner who brings up everything they have done for you during an argument, the friend who remembers every favor and expects equivalent return, the parent who lists their sacrifices when you assert a boundary. This is the argument that ends with, "After everything I've done for you." This is transactional intimacy, and it is far more common than most people realize. In transactional relationships, affection is not given, it is exchanged. I did this for you, so you owe me this. The transaction may not be stated explicitly, but it is understood implicitly, and when the debt is not repaid, the worth withdraws. Research into transactional relationships finds that they are characterized by scorekeeping, conditional support, and surface-level connection. Both parties are monitoring the exchange. Both are ensuring they do not give more than they receive. Both are operating from a scarcity mindset, as if love were finite, as if generosity would leave them depleted. And perhaps in these relationships it would, because the generosity is not generosity, it is investment, and investment requires returns. What makes this particularly corrosive is that transactional dynamics often masquerade as fairness. I am just making sure things are balanced. But fairness in relationships is not about equal exchange, it is about mutual care. And mutual care does not require a ledger. It requires trust that the other person will show up when needed without demanding repayment. In transactional relationships, that trust does not exist. There is only calculation, and calculation kills spontaneity. It kills generosity. It kills the willingness to give without tracking what is owed. Studies of couples in transactional marriages find they report lower intimacy, lower passion, and higher vulnerability to betrayal. Because when love is conditional on continued exchange, the relationship becomes fragile. Any disruption to the balance, illness, unemployment, emotional unavailability, threatens the entire structure. The person who cannot contribute feels disposable. The person who contributes more feels exploited, and neither feels loved. Transactional intimacy also creates what researchers call destructive entitlement. When someone feels they have given more than they have received, they feel entitled to retaliation, to withdraw, to punish, to make the other person pay for the perceived imbalance. And this entitlement justifies all kinds of cruelty, because the ledger says it is owed. But the ledger is a lie, because relationships are not economies, they are ecosystems, and ecosystems do not function on the principle of equal exchange. They function on the principle of interdependence. Sometimes one person gives more, sometimes the other does. Over time, in healthy systems, the flow evens out, but not through reinforcement, through care. Transactional relationships cannot tolerate this kind of trust. They require constant monitoring, constant assessment, constant enforcement of the terms, and this enforcement creates distance, because enforcement requires objectivity, and objectivity is incompatible with intimacy. You cannot simultaneously hold someone accountable to a ledger and hold them close. One requires separation, the other requires connection. And when relationships choose separation, when they prioritize balance over bond, they become something other than intimate. They become contracts, and contracts can be broken when the terms are no longer favorable. If this feels familiar, you are not cynical, you are accurate. Accuracy often feels like bitterness when you were trained not to see. Generosity without expectation feels dangerous in systems built on debt. At some point, some people realize what they are doing. They see the performance, they see the exhaustion, they see the emptiness that persists no matter how much they achieve, how much they accommodate, how much they suppress, and they make a decision to stop, not to leave, not necessarily, but to stop performing, to stop earning, to stop operating inside the emotional economy that has shaped their relationships for as long as they can remember. And when they stop, everything changes, not because you changed, but because the system is exposed, because the people who have been conditioning them, consciously or unconsciously, notice immediately. The supply of compliance stops flowing. The validation they were receiving stops coming. The accommodation they relied on stops happening. And their response reveals the truth of the system. If the relationship was based on genuine connection, the other person adapts. They express concern. They ask what is wrong. They engage with the shift as a communication rather than a defiance. But if the relationship was based on control, the other person escalates. They increase the punishment. They withdraw more aggressively. They accuse the person of being selfish, cold, changed. They demand a return to the old dynamic, because the old dynamic served them, and the new one does not. This is the test, not of the person who stopped performing, of the relationship itself. Does it survive the withdrawal of transaction, or does it collapse? Many collapse, and that collapse is information. It reveals what was always true, that the connection was conditional. The loss is not failure, it is clarity. Because they were never built on connection, they were built on exchange, and when the exchange stops, there is nothing left. Research into conditional regard consistently finds that when individuals begin setting boundaries, asserting needs, and refusing to perform for affection, relationships structured around control deteriorate rapidly. The withholder becomes more withholding, the praiser becomes more critical, the transactional partner becomes more demanding, because the system requires compliance, and compliance has ended. For the person who stops performing, this deterioration is clarifying, painful but clarifying, because it reveals what the relationship always was, not intimacy, economy, and they were never a partner, they were a resource. Some relationships can be renegotiated if both parties are willing to recognize the transactional pattern and work towards something different. But this requires the person who benefited from the transaction to give up the control they had, to accept that affection will no longer be withheld as leverage, that approval will no longer be dispensed as reward, that the other person will no longer perform for love. Most people are not willing to do this, because it requires them to confront the possibility that they were not giving love at all. They were trading it, and trading is not the same as caring. For the person who stops performing, what follows is often loneliness, but not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of realizing that most of their relationships were not real, that they have been surrounded by people who valued their utility more than their being. They were never a partner, they were a resource, not because you agreed to be, but because that was the role available. And this loneliness, though painful, is also the beginning of something, because once you stop performing, you can start being, and being, though uncertain and vulnerable, is the only foundation on which real connection can be built. You have been trained, not by villains, not by sadists, by people who were trained themselves, who learned that love is conditional, that affection is currency, that worth is something earned through performance. This transmission happens quietly, without malice in most cases, just pattern replication, and they pass that system on to you, through their praise, through their withdrawal, through the warmth that appeared when you complied and disappeared when you did not. You internalized it, became both the performer and the audience, the earner and the withholder, the child hoping for approval and the parent deciding whether to give it. And now, somewhere inside you, there is exhaustion, because performing is exhausting, and you have been performing for so long that you do not remember what it feels like to simply be. What if you stopped, not forever, just long enough to see clearly, not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as experiment? What if you stopped performing for affection and observed what happens? Do the people close to you respond with curiosity or punishment, with concern or withdrawal? Do they ask what you need or tell you what you owe? The answer will tell you what their relationships are built on. And if they are built on economy, you have a choice: to continue participating in an exchange system that was never designed for your flourishing, or to walk away toward the uncertainty of connection that does not require earning. The currency system collapses when you stop valuing what it offers, when you recognize that conditional affection is not love, that approval is not acceptance, that performing will never fill the space that only being can fill. You were never meant to earn love, you were meant to receive it because you existed. And if the people in your life cannot offer that, they are not offering love, they are offering transaction. Transaction, no matter how familiar, is not connection. If this strikes something, if you recognize the ledger, the performance, the exhaustion of earning what should have been given, there's more to examine here, and it will not be easier than this. Subscribing means you'll be here for the next investigation. There is more to examine here. Like this video if you are ready to stop performing, if you are ready to see the economy for what it is, if you are ready to walk towards something different, even if you do not yet know what that something is. Understanding the currency system is the first step. Refusing to participate in it is the second. And building relationships based on being rather than earning, that is the work. Uncomfortable work, uncertain work, but the only work that leads to the connection you were seeking all along.